On a bitter February morning in 1511, the most powerful king in Europe held his dying son in his arms, watching helplessly as 7 weeks of hope dissolved into despair. What Henry VIII could not realize in that moment was that this infant's death would unleash a chain of events so catastrophic that it would tear apart the very fabric of English society, send thousands to the executioner's block, and ultimately give rise to one of history's most ruthless monarchs. The child who died that day was more than just a prince. He was the key that might have prevented England's bloodiest chapter. This is not simply the story of a baby's death. It is the story of how a single breath that never came to fruition would echo across centuries, creating ripples of violence, religious upheaval, and political chaos that would reshape a nation. Prince Henry Tudor, Duke of Cornwall, lived for exactly 52 days, but his death would haunt England for generations. Today, we uncover the chilling circumstances surrounding this forgotten tragedy and explore how the loss of one infant set in motion the events that would transform his father into the most feared king in English history. The death of Henry VIII's firstborn wasn't only a personal tragedy, it was the first domino in a sequence that led to the break with Rome, the dissolution of monasteries, the execution of queens, and the rise of a dynasty built on blood and terror. As we delve into this dark chapter, you'll discover how the loss of an innocent child became the catalyst for some of history's most brutal transformations. What you're about to learn will forever change how you view England's most turbulent age. In the winter of 1510, England stood at the pinnacle of European influence, ruled by a young, athletic, and ambitious Henry VIII, who had ascended the throne just 2 years earlier. The kingdom buzzed with optimism. The new monarch, only 19 years old, represented everything his careful and calculating father, Henry VII, had not. Generous, charismatic, and eager to restore England's glory on the European stage. The court glittered with tournaments, banquets, and artistic patronage. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had secured England's most crucial alliance with Spain. Yet beneath this golden surface lay a kingdom still haunted by the shadow of dynastic instability that had plagued England for more than a century. The Wars of the Roses had ended just 26 years earlier, and the Tudor claim to the throne remained fragile, built more on conquest than ancient lineage. Henry's father had spent his entire reign fending off pretenders and rebellions, and the new king knew well that his dynasty's survival depended on producing a male heir to continue the Tudor line. The pressure to secure succession was not simply personal, it was a matter of national survival. In an age where infant mortality claimed nearly 1 in 3 children before their first birthday, and where the death of a monarch without a clear heir could plunge a kingdom into civil war, the birth of a healthy male child meant the difference between stability and chaos. The memories of the Yorkist pretenders Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, who had threatened Henry VII's reign with their claims to the throne, remained fresh in the minds of England's nobility. Catherine of Aragon, 6 years older than her husband and already a widow from her brief marriage to Henry's deceased brother Arthur, carried the weight of both Spain's expectations and England's hopes. Her first pregnancy, which ended in a stillborn daughter in 1510, had been a devastating blow. Reports sent by the Spanish ambassador to Ferdinand of Aragon spoke of Henry's deep anguish and Catherine's profound sorrow, foreshadowing the emotional toll that repeated failures of childbirth would exact on the royal couple. The political landscape of early 16th century Europe demanded strong leadership built on dynastic security. France under Louis XII posed a constant threat to English ambitions, while the Holy Roman Empire under Maximilian pursued shifting alliances. Scotland remained a dangerous neighbor on the northern border, and new religious movements stirring in Germany threatened the established order of Christendom. In this volatile climate, a king without an heir was a king whose crown stood on a knife's edge. Yet Henry and Catherine's hopes rested on the limited knowledge of physicians still trained in medieval traditions of humoral medicine. They understood little of pregnancy or infant mortality beyond superstition and ancient texts. Doctors prescribed bloodletting for expectant mothers, recommended bizarre concoctions of herbs and animal parts, and often worsened outcomes through misguided interventions. The royal couple's reproductive health was literally entrusted to men who believed a woman's womb could wander through her body, and that planetary alignments determined a child's survival. When Catherine announced her second pregnancy in late 1510, the entire kingdom held its breath. This child would either secure the Tudor dynasty's future or plunge England deeper into the uncertainty that had defined the previous century. The stakes could not have been higher. And as winter gave way to the new year of 1511, all of Europe waited for news from the English court. On January 1st, 1511, as England awakened to a new year, Catherine's labor pains began before dawn, triggering carefully prepared rituals that had been planned for months. Richmond Palace was transformed into a sacred chamber where England's destiny would be decided. Heavy tapestries covered the windows to ensure absolute privacy. Braziers burned costly incense to purify the air. Religious relics were placed around the chamber to invoke divine protection. The birthing room resembled a shrine more than a medical facility, its walls draped in precious cloth bearing royal arms, illuminated by the soft glow of hundreds of candles. Their light flickered across golden crucifixes and manuscripts filled with prayers for safe delivery. Catherine's attendants, led by Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, moved with practiced precision through rituals that had governed royal births for centuries. Outside the chamber, Henry VIII paced the corridors, his emotions swinging between soaring hope and gnawing anxiety. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, the infant's cries echoed through the palace, sending an explosion of joy across Richmond. Courtiers who had waited in tense silence erupted into celebrations that would continue for days. The royal physicians, led by Dr. Fernando de Victoria, Catherine's Spanish doctor, proclaimed the birth successful and the child healthy. Midwives carefully examined the newborn prince who would carry the dynasty's hopes. The baby emerged as a perfectly formed male heir, described by witnesses as fair and large, with reddish gold hair that unmistakably marked him as Henry VIII's son. Observers noted his vigor, his lusty cries, and his strong movements, all promising signs of health and vitality. The physicians declared themselves satisfied with his color, breathing, and overall condition. Henry VIII's reaction transformed him from an anxious, pacing father into a man overwhelmed with joy. Contemporary accounts describe him weeping openly, embracing the messenger who brought the news and ordering preparations to announce the birth to the kingdom and to Europe. The king's relief was so profound that witnesses noted his hands trembling as he held the official birth announcement. His voice reportedly broke with emotion as he dictated letters to foreign monarchs, proclaiming the arrival of his heir. Richmond Palace became the center of jubilant celebration as nobles, ambassadors, and court officials arrived to pay homage to the newborn prince. Gifts of gold, silver, jewels, and exotic fabrics poured in from across Europe, each tribute marking the immense political weight of the child's birth.
The great hall filled with triumphant fanfares as servants rushed to prepare elaborate feasts marking the formal announcement. Messengers mounted the fastest horses from the royal stables to carry news of the prince's arrival to every corner of England. Despite her exhaustion from labor, Catherine received a steady stream of visitors in her chambers. The highest-ranking ladies of the court offered congratulations and gazed at the prince who now embodied England's hopes. Spanish courtiers whispered prayers of thanksgiving, relieved that their princess had fulfilled her most vital duty to her adopted kingdom. The announcement of Prince Henry's birth unleashed celebrations unmatched since Henry VIII's coronation. Church bells rang without pause across London for 3 days and nights, a constant peal of triumph audible for miles. Bonfires blazed on hilltops from Cornwall to the Scottish borders, forming a chain of light that foreign observers interpreted as a nation rejoicing in unity. At Westminster Abbey, Archbishop William Warham ordered special Thanksgiving masses every hour. The great cathedral overflowed with nobles, merchants, and commoners alike who came to pray for the prince's health, while marveling at the dazzling displays of royal magnificence. The altar blazed with hundreds of candles and glittered with gold and silver vessels worth more than the yearly incomes of many nobles. Choir voices soared with hymns composed especially for the occasion. Henry VIII also ordered immediate distribution of alms throughout London. Coins stamped with royal arms were tossed from palace windows, while heralds proclaimed the birth in every marketplace. Taverns were granted licenses to serve free ale to all who would drink to the prince's health, fueling celebrations that spilled into the streets and lasted through the nights. For once, ordinary citizens joined the same festivities as the royal court. Foreign ambassadors seized the chance to outshine one another with congratulatory gifts, knowing their generosity would be noticed by Henry and could influence future diplomacy. The Venetian ambassador presented a golden cradle adorned with precious stones. The French delegation arrived with silks and tapestries valued at thousands of pounds. From Spain came holy relics meant to safeguard the infant, along with a chest of gold coins specially minted for the occasion. The birth also inspired Henry VIII to stage a tournament that promised to be the most spectacular pageant of its kind in Europe for a generation. The king himself designed many of the festivities, sparing no expense to ensure they would be remembered for decades. Temporary wooden pavilions covered in cloth of gold rose in the palace grounds. Master craftsmen worked around the clock to create armor and weapons that would later be awarded as tournament prizes. Royal proclamations announced feasts that would feed thousands over multiple days. Palace kitchens labored without pause, producing menus that displayed both England's wealth and Henry's renowned generosity. Exotic delicacies arrived from across Europe and beyond. Peacocks, roasted whole and redressed in their glittering tail feathers, were paraded before guests. Sugar sculptors built elaborate displays depicting scenes of royal triumph, while wines from the choicest vineyards of France and Spain were poured from royal cellars, reserved for just such an extraordinary moment. The sheer scale of these celebrations sent a clear message across Europe. The Tudor dynasty was not merely secure, it commanded the resources and confidence to celebrate lavishly even as rival kingdoms struggled with wars and economic strains. Henry VIII positioned himself as a monarch whose magnificence rivaled and perhaps surpassed any ruler in Christendom. The baptism of Prince Henry Tudor was far more than a religious ceremony. It became a carefully orchestrated diplomatic event designed to cement the infant's place in European politics while displaying England's rising power. Henry's selection of godparents revealed calculated strategy. King Louis XII of France and Margaret of Austria were chosen, symbolically binding England's most significant allies to the child's destiny through sacred ties. The political implications were immense. Religious bonds carried the weight of international diplomacy. The ceremony, held at the Church of the Observant Friars at Richmond Palace, transformed the holy space into a glittering showcase of Tudor splendor. Every surface gleamed with cloth of gold, magnificent tapestries, and religious artifacts valued at more than the annual revenues of entire counties. The baptismal font, commissioned for the occasion, was made of solid silver. It bore the royal arms alongside sacred imagery, underscoring the divine nature of kingship. The holy water itself had been blessed by Archbishop Warham with relics of English saints.
The ceremony, held at the Church of the Observant Friars at Richmond Palace, transformed the holy space into a glittering showcase of Tudor splendor. Every surface gleamed with cloth of gold, magnificent tapestries, and religious artifacts valued at more than the annual revenues of entire counties. The baptismal font, commissioned for the occasion, was made of solid silver. It bore the royal arms alongside sacred imagery, underscoring the divine nature of kingship. The holy water itself had been blessed by Archbishop Warham with relics of English saints. The French king's representative, the Duke of Longueville, arrived with a procession of nobles clad in magnificent attire. Their rich costumes and lavish gifts underscored France's determination to honor the alliance. The Duke presented a golden cup encrusted with jewels, a gift whose symbolism extended far beyond its value. It represented France's recognition of the Tudor dynasty's legitimacy and Henry VIII's place among Europe's monarchs. Margaret of Austria's inclusion as godmother was equally significant. As regent of the Netherlands, she stood among Europe's most powerful women. Her close ties to the Holy Roman Empire and Spain made her uniquely placed to bridge England with continental power centers. Her role was represented by the Countess of Surrey, acting as her proxy, demonstrating Habsburg commitment to maintain cordial relations with Henry, despite the tangled rivalries of European politics. The baptismal ritual itself followed ancient traditions that emphasized the sacred nature of royal authority. The infant prince was dressed in robes of white silk embroidered with golden thread. The chrism used for his anointing had been specially prepared with oils blessed by the Pope himself. Contemporary chroniclers noted the baby remained calm throughout the lengthy ceremony, which was interpreted as a favorable omen for his temperament and potential fitness to rule. His strong, clear cries at key moments were taken as proof of his vitality and constitution. For the assembled nobility, the deeper meaning of the event was impossible to miss. Attendance and behavior during the ceremony were not simply acts of devotion, they were statements of loyalty. Every bow, every gift, every whispered word would be remembered by Henry VIII, influencing who rose and who fell in the politics of his court. The days following the baptism brought elaborate displays of loyalty and a flood of competitive gift-giving, reflecting the immense stakes surrounding the prince's birth. The ceremony concluded with a magnificent feast that lasted well into the night, with entertainment provided by England's finest musicians and poets. The infant prince himself was displayed to assembled guests as a living symbol of the Tudor dynasty's secure future. The establishment of the prince's own royal household, immediately after his baptism, revealed Henry VIII's confidence in his heir's survival and his determination to provide every possible advantage. A miniature court was created solely for the infant, employing dozens of servants and costing enormous sums to maintain. Yet its very existence stood as a visible symbol of royal wealth and the dynasty's commitment to succession. Prince Henry Tudor's brief existence unfolded within this carefully constructed household, one that rivaled many European courts in its complexity and expense. Henry VIII spared no effort in ensuring his son received care befitting the future King of England. The prince's apartments at Richmond Palace were redesigned specifically to meet his needs. Chambers were kept at carefully regulated temperatures by teams of servants who tended constant fires, while the walls were hung with tapestries depicting heroic English victories intended to inspire greatness even in his earliest months. The infant's daily routine was governed by protocols refined over centuries of royal childcare. Every feeding, every clothing change, every moment of sleep was carefully recorded by attendants whose positions carried enormous responsibility for the dynasty's future. The royal nursery itself employed more than 30 individuals. Wet nurses were chosen not only for their perfect health but also for their moral character. Rockers had the sole duty of keeping the cradle in constant motion, while watchers maintained an unbroken vigil throughout the night to ensure the child's safety and comfort. Dr. Fernando de Victoria established a strict regimen combining the latest medical knowledge with traditional practices. He prescribed specific diets for the wet nurses to ensure the best quality milk and ordered regular examinations to monitor the infant's progress. Surviving reports in the royal archives describe a child who initially appeared healthy, gaining weight steadily, responding appropriately to stimuli, and displaying a robust constitution that seemed to promise a long reign. Even the prince's wardrobe represented a major investment. Tiny garments were crafted from silk, velvet, and cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls and fine threads, creating miniature works of art fit for England's heir. Each outfit was blessed by the royal chaplain before being placed on the infant. His swaddling clothes, changed multiple times daily, were made of linens prepared according to customs believed to strengthen health and vigor. Henry VIII visited his son's apartments daily, often spending hours simply watching the infant sleep or feed. Courtiers remarked on the king's paternal devotion, noting how his face lit with pride whenever he spoke of his son. Visitors were surprised by Henry's gentle manner when holding the child, an image of fatherhood rarely seen in monarchs, usually defined by their politics and military power. Security around the infant was extraordinary, even by royal standards. Guards stood at every entrance, and food tasters ensured that nothing potentially harmful reached the prince, even through the diets of his wet nurses. This level of caution reflected both Henry VII's legacy of paranoia and the recognition that the child's life was the foundation upon which England's stability rested. Strict protocols determined who could approach the infant. Even high-ranking nobles were required to undergo purification rituals before entering the nursery. Daily reports on the child's condition were prepared for the king's review, documenting everything from sleeping patterns to feeding habits and responses to touch or sound. This detailed record reflected both parental concern and the political necessity of monitoring the heir's health with precision, a practice that would become standard for future royal children. The first signs of trouble appeared in the 6th week of Prince Henry's life. Royal physicians noted subtle changes in his behavior. Though not immediately alarming, these small shifts marked a departure from the strong vitality he had shown since birth. His feeding patterns became inconsistent, sometimes eager, but often followed by periods of listlessness when he showed little interest in nourishment. Dr. Victoria ordered more frequent examinations and consulted colleagues about possible causes. Court observers, who had grown used to seeing the child cry loudly and move with vigor, began to notice spells of unusual quietness. At this early stage, physicians kept their concerns private, hoping these changes reflected nothing more than normal fluctuations in infant behavior. Reports from wet nurses indicated the prince sometimes struggled to nurse, requiring more effort to stimulate his appetite. His periods of sleep grew longer, and waking moments became less active. The nursery staff, trained to notice the smallest details, observed that his complexion occasionally seemed paler than usual. These symptoms appeared irregularly, making it difficult to determine whether they signaled genuine illness or merely natural variation. Dr. Victoria increased monitoring of the infant's breathing, temperature, and general responsiveness, while privately consulting ancient medical texts and seeking advice from colleagues. Henry VIII, during his daily visits, began to sense something was amiss. Although physicians could not offer a clear diagnosis, the king's questions about his son's condition became increasingly frequent and urgent. His unease reflected the awareness that the stability of his dynasty rested on this fragile child. Catherine of Aragon, still recovering from childbirth, yet determined to remain close to her son, began spending more time in the nursery. With a mother's intuition, she sensed her child was not thriving as expected. Her Spanish attendants noted her growing worry, though she maintained a public appearance of calm. Privately, she pressed physicians for reassurance, desperate to believe the signs were not serious. At court, the atmosphere shifted as whispers spread among the nobility. Though most avoided speaking openly, the rumors reflected a shared anxiety. Any serious illness in the prince threatened not only the royal family, but the political stability of the entire kingdom. By the beginning of February, the symptoms had become pronounced enough that Dr. Victoria felt obligated to inform the king directly of his concerns. He explained that infant health could be unpredictable and emphasized that many children who showed early weakness recovered and lived healthy lives. But he also cautioned that the prince's condition required constant vigilance, subtly preparing the royal family for the possibility of decline. The end came with devastating swiftness. In the early morning hours of February 22nd, 1511, the prince's condition worsened dramatically. Night watchers in the nursery noted his breathing had grown labored and irregular, while his skin took on a grayish pallor that physicians recognized as a dire sign. Dr. Victoria and other royal doctors were summoned at once. Despite frantic efforts, the medical team could do little. Remedies of the age, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and but prayers were all attempted. The royal chaplain was called to offer blessings as the child's tiny frame weakened further. The prince's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly throughout the morning. The cries that had once been strong and vigorous at birth now grew faint and irregular, while his tiny body seemed to fight against forces that physicians could neither diagnose nor treat. The doctors, despite their efforts, were reduced to helpless witnesses of the tragedy unfolding before them. Henry VIII arrived at the nursery to find his son in the final stages of whatever mysterious illness had overtaken him. Contemporary accounts describe the king's anguish as he held the dying infant, his powerful frame shaking with grief as he watched his heir's brief life slip away. The sight of England's most commanding monarch reduced to a grieving father, unable to save his child despite all his authority and wealth, was one of the most poignant moments in Tudor history. Witnesses later described Henry's tears falling onto his son's fragile form. The exact moment of the prince's death was recorded by royal clocks at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, after a final struggle during which his breathing grew shallow until it ceased altogether. Dr. Victoria officially pronounced the infant dead, despite desperate attempts at revival that had occasionally saved other children. Prince Henry Tudor, Duke of Cornwall, had passed beyond all earthly intervention, leaving behind a kingdom whose future was suddenly uncertain once again. Catherine of Aragon's reaction was immediate and devastating. She collapsed into grief so overwhelming that attendants feared for her own health. Her Spanish ladies-in-waiting later wrote that she appeared to age years within the space of hours. As the reality of her loss settled upon her, the Queen's anguished cries echoed through the corridors of Richmond Palace, creating an atmosphere of sorrow that quickly spread across the court. Royal physicians now faced the grim task of explaining the cause of death. Their examinations revealed no clear explanation. They concluded that the infant had likely succumbed to one of the many unexplained ailments that claimed so many children in an age of high infant mortality. Their official report attributed the death to natural causes, while admitting they could not determine the specific illness. This uncertainty would haunt both Henry and Catherine for years to come. Richmond Palace, which only weeks earlier had been the center of magnificent celebration, now transformed into a house of mourning. Elaborate plans for festivities were cancelled and replaced with somber rituals required for royal death. Messengers prepared to carry the devastating news across Europe to the very courts where the prince's birth had been celebrated with such enthusiasm just weeks earlier. Henry VIII's public response to his son's death revealed the complex balancing act required of monarchs in the 16th century. Kings were expected to maintain dignity even in the face of personal devastation. Adopting a carefully composed demeanor, Henry concealed his grief, though those close to him could see it gnawed at his spirit. Contemporary accounts note that within days of the death, the king appeared in public, conducting royal business with outward composure while privately wrestling with anguish that threatened his legendary self-control. Henry's immediate concern focused on preventing panic about succession. He understood that any sign of weakness might encourage enemies at home and abroad to exploit the kingdom's sudden vulnerability. Royal proclamations emphasized that while the loss of Prince Henry was deeply mourned, the king remained young and strong, with every expectation of producing more heirs. It was a narrative of resilience, carefully crafted to maintain political stability during a time of profound uncertainty. Yet behind this facade of control, Henry's personal behavior betrayed the depth of his sorrow. Courtiers noted his sudden irritability, his tendency to withdraw from social pleasures, and his obsessive dedication to hunting and military exercises. Activities that seemed designed to exhaust his body and distract his mind. The king's famous appetite for entertainment diminished markedly, replaced by a grim seriousness that would increasingly characterize his reign. The funeral of Prince Henry Tudor became one of the most elaborate and costly ceremonies in English royal history. Henry VIII channeled his grief into a display of royal magnificence that would demonstrate to Europe both the dynasty's wealth and its determination to honor the deceased heir with splendor. Preparations required weeks of labor by hundreds of craftsmen, artists, and servants working around the clock to produce a funeral worthy of a future king. Westminster Abbey was transformed into a grand cathedral of mourning. Every surface was draped in the finest black cloth, while thousands of candles created a vast forest of flickering light that burned throughout the multi-day ceremonies. The high altar was covered in cloth of gold and surrounded by relics worth fortunes. The prince's tiny coffin, crafted from the finest English oak and covered in velvet with gilded ornamentation, occupied the position of honor beneath a specially commissioned canopy. The funeral procession stretched for miles through London. Beginning at Richmond Palace, it moved slowly through the capital while thousands of citizens lined the route to pay their respects. The sight was extraordinary. Mounted nobles in full ceremonial dress, clergy carrying banners and chanting hymns, and representatives of every London guild and merchant company marching in solemn order. The procession was so vast, it took hours to pass any single point. The burial service itself, conducted by Archbishop Warham with the assistance of dozens of high-ranking clergy, featured music specially composed for the occasion. Nobles participated in rituals emphasizing both Christian hope for resurrection and the monarchy's claim to divine favor despite tragedy. The service concluded with the symbolic breaking of the prince's staff of office and the formal declaration that the prince is dead. Prayers immediately followed for the king and queen's health and hopes for future heirs. The immediate aftermath of the prince's death sent shockwaves through European diplomacy. Ambassadors quickly reassessed their strategies in light of England's uncertain succession. At the French court, plans for military campaigns premised on English stability were reconsidered. In Spain, officials worried about Catherine of Aragon's weakened influence, since her primary value to England was tied to her ability to produce heirs. Within England, the nobility faced the delicate task of recalibrating their positions at court. Families that had aligned themselves closely with the infant prince now found their investments in royal favor suddenly meaningless. Others saw opportunity in offering comfort and support to the grieving king and queen, seeking to advance their own influence. The death sparked a succession crisis that would haunt Henry VIII for the rest of his reign. Once a confident and optimistic young king, he began to change. The trauma of losing his son, just weeks after celebrating what had seemed the secure future of his dynasty, left deep psychological scars. It fed his growing paranoia about divine favor and his obsession with producing a male heir at any cost. This obsession would transform English society in ways unimaginable in 1511. In later years, Henry's desperation for a surviving son would lead to broken marriages, executions of queens, the break with Rome, and the destruction of monasteries. All of it, in some measure, traced back to the loss of the tiny boy who lived just 52 days. Catherine of Aragon's position also became immediately more precarious. Though her vulnerability did not fully surface for several years, the failure to produce a living male heir lingered as a shadow over her queenship. While she would conceive again, each subsequent loss deepened Henry's frustration and suspicion that divine disfavor hung over their marriage. This created a cycle of hope and despair that slowly eroded Henry's confidence in his marriage, while establishing a pattern of royal pregnancy anxiety that would shadow every subsequent conception. Elaborate precautions, religious rituals, and constant observances were introduced to prevent further tragedy, though these efforts often increased stress rather than easing it. The broader implications for English succession law soon became clear. With Prince Henry gone, Henry VIII began contemplating scenarios once unthinkable, including the possibility of female inheritance through surviving daughters or the need to recognize distant relatives as heirs. These discussions forced the king and his advisors to confront legal precedents and constitutional principles that had long remained theoretical during times of secure male succession. In the years following the prince's death, Catherine of Aragon endured increasingly desperate attempts to provide the king with the male heir he demanded. Pregnancy after pregnancy ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the death of an infant, Each announcement brought back the excitement that had accompanied Prince Henry's birth. But every loss deepened the court's anxiety and strengthened the superstitions surrounding royal reproduction. These repeated failures drained both resources and emotional energy while producing no surviving sons. Henry's response to these continued losses evolved over time, from patient support in the early years to frustration and finally to open hostility toward his wife. He began to blame Catherine personally for their inability to secure the succession, reflecting the limited medical understanding of the time which attributed fertility struggles entirely to women. The king's desperation also fueled increasingly elaborate religious gestures. He ordered pilgrimages to holy shrines, made vast charitable donations to monasteries, and commissioned special masses and prayers. These efforts consumed significant sums from the royal treasury, but failed to bring the result he longed for, a living male heir. The death of Prince Henry on that February morning in 1511 stands as one of history's clearest examples of how a single moment can redirect the course of civilization. In just 52 days of life, and with his sudden death, England's destiny shifted from Catholic stability toward religious revolution, political upheaval, and cultural transformation. Had Prince Henry survived to adulthood and become King Henry IX, English and European history would have followed an entirely different path. With a male heir secured, Henry VIII's desperate quest for sons would never have arisen. Catherine of Aragon's position as queen would have remained unchallenged, eliminating the marriage to Anne Boleyn that triggered England's break with Rome. The religious map of the 16th century Europe would also have looked very different. If England had remained firmly Catholic under Henry IX, the Reformation in its English form might never have taken place. Elizabeth I, arguably England's greatest monarch, would never have been born, as Anne Boleyn would have remained a minor figure rather than queen. Without Elizabeth, the Elizabethan age with its explosion of literature, overseas exploration, and naval strength would not have occurred. The defeat of the Spanish Armada and the rise of England as a naval superpower might never have happened. Equally, the massive social and economic upheavals caused by the English Reformation would not have taken place. The vast wealth of the monasteries would have remained in church hands instead of being seized and redistributed among the nobility. English society, law, and culture would have evolved along entirely different lines. The tragic irony is stark. Henry VIII's desperate search for the son he had already possessed and lost ultimately drove him to destroy much of what he sought to preserve. His marriage, his church, his nobility, and even the lives of thousands of his subjects. The infant who died in his father's arms had already secured the Tudor succession, but his death left a wound that festered for decades, poisoning Henry's relationships and shaping the kingdom's fate. The implications extend far beyond the Tudor dynasty itself. The Protestant Reformation in England, the rise of Anglicanism, the growing authority of Parliament, the establishment of English naval supremacy, and eventually the creation of the British Empire, all can be traced, directly or indirectly, to the grief and desperation that consumed Henry VIII after his son's death. Perhaps most chilling is the recognition that the violence and religious persecution of Henry's later reign grew from this trauma. The executions of Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, the dissolution of the monastery, the burning of religious dissenters, and even the beheadings of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard all stemmed from the psychological devastation caused by watching his infant heir die, despite every advantage that wealth and power could provide. The Henry who cradled his dying son in 1511 was not yet the tyrant who would terrify England for 4 decades. But the seeds of that transformation were sown in those hours of helpless anguish. The empty cradle at Richmond Palace became, in its own way, one of the most influential objects in English history. Its silence and vacancy drove Henry to actions that reshaped not only England, but also the wider world in his relentless quest to fill it with another son. Sometimes, the most consequential figures in history are those who never lived long enough to shape events themselves. Prince Henry Tudor's brief life and early death echoed through centuries, leaving an impact far greater than his short existence should have allowed. His passing set in motion the chain of events that changed religion, politics, and culture across the globe. As we reflect on this forgotten tragedy, we are left with a haunting truth. The freedoms, institutions, and cultural achievements that emerged from England's traumatic 16th century were purchased at a staggering cost, built upon the grave of an innocent child whose only fault was to die too soon.